Matt and I, especially I, because I have more trouble restraining myself from talking, I will work very hard not to talk too much and just give you lots of chances to ask questions. Okay. Before I jump into other versions of the consequence argument, I would just say that there has been a huge literature on this transfer principle. I mean, I've already said that, but there's been a recent interesting article published in the Canadian Journal of Philosophy by Alexander Pruss of Baylor, and it's called A Proof of Incompatibilism, but it's not really a proof of incompatibilism. It's a proof of principle beta, or of the transfer principle, interpreted in a specific way. And there's been an interesting discussion on Flickers of Freedom. How many of you know that blog, Flickers of Freedom? It's worth looking at. It's definitely worth looking at. Flickers of Freedom. There was an interesting discussion initiated by David Whitaker of Alexander Pruss's article. And Alexander pointed out that, well, he was encouraged to call it something more dramatic than his original title, so he called it A Proof of Incompatibilism. But it's a proof of the transfer principle, the modal principle. And what I think is going on is that there are crucial terms. If you think about it, remember I was pretty vague when I said, let's say, S has no control at T over P, or S doesn't have a choice about P. But there are various ways of kind of making that more specific, what it means to have a choice about something, what it means for it to be the case that you can have control over some proposition. And what I think is, you can specify precisely what that is, and when you do specify precisely what that is, you give it an interpretation, it will render some of the principles uncontroversially true. So you'll be able, let's say, to prove the transfer principle. But then, given that interpretation, it will become less uncontroversial, and indeed, it will become unclear that the other principles are true, or at least it will become, there will be wiggle room to kind of reject the fixity of the past or the fixity of the laws. And I think there is this general feature of the debates, and that is that you have to give accounts of having a choice about, or being able to render false a proposition. And once you've given a more precise account, again, certain elements of the argument will become more plausible, but then other elements will become at least open to counter moves or rejection. And you see the classical compatibilists like John Perry and Keith Blair and Terence Horgan, and most famously perhaps David Lewis, kind of making these moves and rejecting the principle. So I think you get to a kind of dialectical stalemate, or a situation where it's just unclear exactly what to say. But in any case, let me just say, because of all these debates about principle beta, you might find it helpful to have other ways of regimenting the common sense idea that the past is fixed and the laws of nature are fixed. So I give a second version of the argument on page 21. I think it's pretty simple and natural. And so here's the way it goes. My claim is, this is a simple, natural way of formulating the consequence argument that doesn't use a modal principle, but it does use this principle that I call the fixity of the past and the laws. And here it is. It's on the bottom of page 21. It's due to Carl Genet at Cornell. An agent has it within his power to do A only if his doing A can be an extension of the actual past holding the laws of nature fixed. So that's the idea in Genet, that, as he put it, my freedom is always the freedom or the power to extend the actual past, holding fixed the laws of nature. It's this intuitive idea that, so let's say now I have it in my power to, let's say I do, well, here, I don't lift up my coffee cup now, but we think I have it in my power to lift up the coffee cup. Intuitively, I mean, ordinarily we just think that's natural. Let's say right now I'm not lifting it up, but right before this instant I had the power to lift it up. We don't think about the past and the laws when we make those attributions. They're just common sense attributions. But upon reflection, what Genet is suggesting is that what I really think is my lifting my coffee cup in that exact circumstance could have been an extension of the past, holding the laws fixed. Everything about the past could have been the same, and the laws could have been the same, and I lift the coffee cup. I didn't, but when we think intuitively that I had that alternative possibility, that's presupposed. So it really does correspond to this picture. I guess I've already kind of made it messy here, but the idea is, let's say I'm at this point in time, and let's say I actually go on the right path, but intuitively I could have gone on the left path. What Genet is saying is, this is really the right way of thinking about it. The future is a garden of forking paths. This is, the branching tree-like structure is the way to model our ordinary conception of freedom. Because what we're saying is, here, though I did go on the right path, I could have gone on the left, and here, you know, the picture is nice. The left path is an extension of the actual past, and we can add holding the laws of nature fixed. But this is a nice picture. Here, let me, let's see, let's do it over here. Let's see, I guess I'm just supposed to tear it off. Is that it when I'm, okay, so here, okay, we'll keep this as a souvenir. Okay, so this is the natural view. The future, you know, it's a garden of forking paths in the sense that if I'm here, right here at this node, and I actually go to the right, if I could have gone to the left, I can trace back into the past and look at this as an extension of the actual past. Now, what does the multiple past compatibilist can't have this picture, must have a different picture. And so it's almost as if the picture is something like this, that this is the actual world here, or this is the actual path, or the actual world. And at this time here, this is supposed to, I should have modeled it. Okay, so let's go up here. This is the time in question. And if I do X here, nevertheless, there are certain circumstances in which I could have done Y. And I could have done what? Not, you know, if there's some obstacle, someone is manipulating my brain or has a gun to my head and I have an irresistible urge to comply, then I can't do otherwise. But in certain ordinary conditions, I could have done otherwise. And that means I have access to this other path that's different all the way back. So it's different. It has a completely different past. So I can jump, I call it world hopping, or you can jump from one world or one path to another that has a completely different past. And now you're going to go on from there. And then if at this time you do Z or Z, but you could have done Z prime, that means you have access again to a world with a different past all the way back. That's the multiple past compatibilist picture. And it's just not a natural picture. It's now, granted, there are lots of reasons to think, as Dennett, for instance, thinks, that a kind of ability that holds fixed everything in the past is not what we really care about. Nevertheless, Genet is going to say, still, upon reflection, you can see that this compatibilist picture is messy, unnatural. That's not really the way we think. We tend to think that my possibilities branch off a single path. And that's what this is.
Yeah. I think that there's also another possibility.
Okay. Here we go.
Let's say this is past, and this is future. And
Okay.
there's one line here. But one can say that in future, there's like different paths going like this, which means that, well, at this point, you can only go this way.
Yeah.
But later on, this is T1, T2, T3. At T2, I can go this way, which is, and that's what we mean when we say we can.
Yeah.
It's not that we can at this particular slice, time slice, but you can probably do this at T2, or so when we're standing here, we're looking at the possibilities.
For future. Yeah, that's a different. Yeah, now let me just point out that, I agree that there is that. That's a kind of important point. But here, of course, I was thinking time was going vertically, and then you switch it to horizontally, so it
No, I switch it to vertically.
Oh, you were thinking.
One is.
Oh, okay. So yeah,
different actions can take. I can do A. This is to the left. I can do B, which is to the right, and then C, whatever. And then time is going vertically.
Also, in your view, time is going vertically.
Yes.
But I can, and maybe I can't.
When I'm setting at T0, I can do at T1, I can do A, at T2, I can do B.
Yes.
So I have alternatives.
Yes, I may not be able to do those things at T0, but I can do them in the future.
Yeah.
Yes, that's definitely a possibility. We have to.
But at any one point in time,
Yeah.
there's only
At any one point of time.
Yeah.
But still, you will be able to do it or not do it. So this will be the same kind of influence.
Yeah, I think that
But if determinism is true, then you wouldn't be able to do it or not do it. If you're determined to do it or you're determined to not do it.
So if I'm at T0, if time is going vertically and I'm at T0, and then, okay, here it is, then T1, T2, right. So it might be that circumstances here are such, I do X and I can't do Y at all because Y is precluded. But it might be that I can do Y at T1, that's true. And that I can do, and maybe I can't do Z either at T0, but I can at T2, that's fine. But as I think Oksana was pointing out, that if I do Y here, there is still the question, could I have done otherwise? And the Genet type argument, the incompatibilist is going to say, well, I could have done otherwise there only if, you know, there is an alternative possibility branching off the actual past in which I do not Y. The multiple past compatibilist is going to say, no, let's say I do Y there. Could I do not Y? Yes, because there's another world with a completely different past in which I do not Y. And I'm just saying that's not a natural picture, though it may be the best. Maybe our natural picture is problematic. Now, let me say there's another, people probably know that there's another kind of classical compatibilism where you just say, oh no, what I can do is act in such a way that the laws are different, so you can then branch off a single path. What's a little complex and interesting is David Lewis actually, he's the most famous classical compatibilist perhaps. Well, I don't know if that's fair to say, and contemporary, but he's known for being a local miracle compatibilist, so thinking we can so act that the laws would have been different. But his own view is that you actually sometimes can so act that the past would have been a little bit different, not the remote past, but the past just previous to your action, just prior to your action. And the past is different in such a way as to allow for a miracle to happen, allow for a divergence from the actual law. So he actually thinks a little of both. The past would have had to be different, not the remote past, but the past would have had to be different and laws. All right, but let me just get this argument out. It uses the idea that when I have it in my power to do otherwise, I must have it in my power to extend the actual past, holding the laws fixed. So then we can just present the argument on 22. I'll just use this. It's pretty simple. If we start with the assumption that determinism obtains, and let's say that someone does A at time t3, some ordinary act, it follows from the truth of causal determinism that the state of the world at t1, together with the natural laws, entails that S does A at t3. That is, in all possible scenarios in which that state of the world obtains at t1, conjoined with the actual natural laws, S does A at t3. That's just the definition of entailment. But the principle of the fixity of the past and laws states that an agent can perform an act only if his performing that act could be an extension of the actual past, holding the laws fixed. But given the entailment just described, S's refraining from doing A at t3 cannot be an extension of the actual past, holding the laws of nature fixed. That is, given causal determinism, one could not even in principle trace out a path along which the natural laws obtain from the actual past to S's refraining from doing A at t3. Thus, S cannot at t2 refrain from doing A at t3. Okay, so it's kind of, and again, it's a pretty simple idea and a pretty simple argument. So the idea is, let's say we're at this time. Let's say this is t0, this is t1, and this is t2. Okay? And let's say this is a depiction of what, let's say, putatively, or what it appears or seems to me is possible. We're not saying that this maps onto a reality in a deterministic world, but the idea is, if, let's say determinism is true, and we're at T2, the question is, even though I take the right path here, intuitively, I might think I could have taken the left path. But what the argument says is, I can take the left path only if taking the left path is an extension, can be an extension of the actual past, holding the laws fixed. But since we've assumed determinism, we know that the state of the universe at t0, together with the laws of nature, entail that I take the right path. That it follows that there is no possible world in which the past is as it is, and I take the left path. So that's blocked. So this picture is then misleading in a certain way. It's what I might have thought intuitively, but once I am clear about the fact that determinism is true, then I know I can't get to that other path. So that's the idea. It's a simple argument. It's what I call the basic version of the consequence argument. It uses the idea. Let me just simplify as much as and then I'll get you, Joe. The simple idea is, whenever I can do otherwise, it must be that you could draw a line from the actual past to my doing otherwise, my doing the act in question, and holding the laws fixed. The problem is, if we assume determinism is true, then you can't draw a line, even in principle, between the actual past and my doing otherwise. Because the actual past and the laws entail that I act as I do. So every world that has the actual past and the actual laws will be one in which I do as I actually do. So there's no way I can get there. I mean, I like the metaphor that says, in order for me to be able to go along a path, I have to be able to get there from here. I have to be able to get there from here. And that's the problem with, I think, multiple past compatibilism, is that it's hard to see how I can get there from here. I mean, the only way to get there is to jump to a situation where I have a different past, and I just can't get there from here. It's almost as though, if you know in the morning you're starting up to see a waterfall, or you could either see a waterfall or see a beautiful river that's not part of the waterfall. And you know that to see the gorge, you have to walk up the right side the right trail. And to see the waterfall, to see the waterfall, let's say you have to walk up the right side of the gorge, the trail that goes to the right side. To see the river, you have to walk up the trail that goes to the left. But it takes the whole day in either case. So let's say at noon, you've already started up the path that goes on the left. That was the river path. And at noon, you're having lunch, and you say, I kind of changed my mind. Now I want to see the waterfall. Your problem is you really can't get there from where you are. Because in order to get there, you would have had to start early in the morning on the other trail. And you can't just jump over. The gorge is too big. This is where we're in upstate New York now, in Ithaca, where I did my graduate work. And I was thinking about this example, but I was thinking about the consequence argument. It's almost like a certain kind of classical compatibilist, the multiple path compatibilist, thinks you can jump to a different side of the gorge, but you can't get there from here. That's the intuition. Okay, Joe.
So, you had mentioned Lewis's response to sort of this line of thought, and I don't want to delve too in depth into it, but I mean, is his idea in Are We Free to Break the Law, something like that, or a paper like that, I guess, is that you can't hold the past, and he would say maybe you could get to those other paths because given the actual past and the actual laws, given how you specify the rigidity of those, you can't have both of them be strong enough to prevent you from actually getting to the other path?
Yeah, well, what he would say is, I mean, I think that the most compelling compatibilist ways of analyzing the argument first have to say, or should be thought of as saying that we're thinking really of the relationship between counterfactuals and claims about freedom. And so what you really need to figure out first is, if we assume determinism, which counterfactuals would be true? And that's just a question about, it doesn't have anything to do yet with free will. It just is a question about, under determinism, which counterfactuals would be true. So we assume, let's say at T2 I take the right fork in that picture. Now let's say we've assumed determinism is true. Now what Lewis was going to invite us and encourage us to think about is this: what would have been the case had I taken the left path instead? So what would have been the case? What counterfactual is true there? And again, notice, we're not yet saying anything about free will, ability, can. We're just stepping back and saying what counterfactual would be true. Now, some people think the backtracking counterfactual would be true. So that if I had gone on the left side, taken the left path, the past would have had to have been different all the way back, if determinism is true. And that corresponds to that picture there where you're jumping to a different path. So that would be one. And in contemporary philosophy, Jonathan Bennett has written, has defended that view, that that's the kind of backtracker that's the counterfactual that would be true. But Lewis says no. Lewis, and again, this is what's so interesting about his view, is he's coming to it not bringing any intuitions about freedom into it yet. He's just saying, let's think about the right which counterfactual is true, and let's bring to that question my theory of counterfactuals, which he thinks is the best theory. And what it says is, you evaluate a counterfactual by asking what would be the case in the antecedent worlds that are closest or most similar to the actual world. So what he wants to say is, in the closest or most similar to the actual world, possible worlds in which I took the left path, it wouldn't be the case that the past would be different all the way back. Those are not the closest worlds. The closest worlds are the worlds in which most of the past is the same, but there's a tiny change in the past right before the divergence, which allows for a tiny difference in the laws of nature. So the laws of nature are going to be a little different, and the past is going to be a little different. And so that's really, so, you know, what would be the case then, or what the counterfactual is something like this. If I had taken the left path, the past just prior to my act would have been different, and the laws would have been different. But the past wouldn't have been different all the way back. So that's what he's saying. And now what he's saying is, how does that relate to ability to do otherwise, or freedom to do otherwise? What he's saying is, there's no conceptual or other bar to my saying, conjoining a can claim with this counterfactual. So I would say I could have taken the left path, and so it's a conjunction. I could have taken the left path, and if I had taken the left path, the past just prior to my action would have been different, and the laws would have been different. But he wants to say there's no inconsistency in the two conjuncts. You could say both things. So he thinks somehow the incompatibilist is confused and is thinking, well, that if determinism is true, then I could cause the past to be different, or I could initiate a causal sequence that goes into the past, or I could violate a natural law in the sense that I could do something that itself would be or would cause a violation of the natural laws. But that's what Lewis is saying is, so this is an important part of Lewis's view. He's saying, where am I? That it's not going to be exactly this picture, but it's going to be very similar to this picture. He's going to say, this is wrong. It's wrong that if I had done Y, the past would have been different all the way back. What's true is, if I had taken this path here, the left path, there would be a slight divergence right here. Somehow the past, I don't know how to draw the picture exactly. The path in this is the way to draw it. And then there's a little blip here where the path, so here now, as I'm walking along this path, I have not exactly extended the actual path, but I've come pretty close. I've extended it all the way like this, but there would be a little miracle right before T2 that allows for a little discontinuity there. And he thinks there's no inconsistency. It's not as though I'm... So what happens is the violation occurs just prior to the act. And so there would be different natural laws, but it's not as though the act itself is a violation of the... so anyway, it's somewhat delicate, and people have very mixed opinions about Lewis's move here. But that is, did that help at least?
Yes,
Okay, yes, Sophia.
Yeah, I mean, Helen Bigby, I think, if I remember correctly, wrote some paper about that. Lewis have otherwise defended a very weak view on laws of nature.
Yeah.
Sort of Jungian laws of nature are basically regularities that we discover. It's not like the laws of nature is some kind of thing in the universe. So she thinks that he should say, basically, that if I had put my hand up right now, then that would have made the laws of nature be a little bit different, because they're just regularities, and there would be different regularities if I had done that. So.
That's the so-called Humean compatibilism.
Yeah.
That the laws of nature don't have some compelling force or necessitating force, that they're mere regularities.
So, I mean, Lewis' view sounds really strange if you think of laws of nature as being this thing in the universe, but then when you think of them in the Humean way, it sounds almost trivial.
Much more plausible, yes. So that is true in general, that if you think, let me say this, an important dimension in one's evaluation of the consequence argument is how you conceive of the natural laws. And if you think of them as, in a strong way, as having this necessitating force built into them, that almost push people to behave as they do. And you see that in Laura Ekstrom's work. I mean, she talks about the laws of nature pushing, literally. If you think of them that way, then the consequence argument becomes much more plausible. If you think of them just as regularities, as summaries or regularities of in our behavior, then it becomes much less plausible. I mean, why can't we now violate a natural law? Now, I mean, what is true is, see, if you held a Humean view like that, which Beebe and Mealy investigate, I'm not sure, I don't remember whether they actually endorse it. You know, Mealy himself doesn't endorse, he almost endorses nothing, but that's not quite fair. But I mean, he's an agnostic about these issues. He wants to present them, you know, in their best light, but he hasn't come to the conclusion that compatibilism is true. But I think they wanted to present Humean compatibilism, and I just want to say there's a difference between that view and Lewis's, in that even though Lewis himself is, broadly speaking, a Humean, the difference is he thinks there's an important distinction between so acting that a law would not have been a law and actually violating a natural law. And he thinks if you violate a natural law, your act itself would be or cause a law not to be a law.
I think Beebe's point was that he shouldn't make that.
Said that, yeah.
Yeah, because he's a human.
Yes, right. So that's an interesting point. So in other words, you could say that distinction is something that Lewis did make a big deal of, but perhaps he shouldn't have. If he was such a strong Humean about the natural laws, then maybe he should have been comfortable saying we can violate natural laws, not just so act that they wouldn't have been a law. I mean, I think he wanted to avoid, see, once you go in for this view that says, natural laws are just regularities, summaries, and we can, in certain circumstances, violate natural laws, where do you stop exactly? Because, you know, can I now fly faster than the speed of sound, or can I now can I be on the moon in 5 minutes? Well, you know, intuitively, no. And the natural explanation is, well, the laws of nature and the laws of physics constrain us in certain ways. But now it seems that might be unavailable. Now, you know, if you really are a strong kind of Humean and you think you can go around violating the natural laws. So I think he would want to, somehow he wanted to avoid those implausible implications. Yishai, did you have something?
Oh yeah, I had a question about this one passage in Lewis's "Are We Free to Break the Laws," which has always puzzled me.
Okay.
So I'll just read it and see if I can get clarification on it. So he says, "If I could have raised my hand despite the fact that determinism is true and I did not raise it, then indeed it is true both in the weak sense and in the strong sense that I could have rendered false the conjunction HL of history and law." That passage has always puzzled me because I always thought that the way Lewis wanted to go is, you know, we have this weak sense of ability and the strong sense of ability, and we have this strong sense of ability over like smashing the table and stuff like that, but we only have a weak sense of ability over the laws, the past, and the conjunction of the laws in the past. But here he seems to deny that, and I don't know why he said that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know either. I'd have to go back and look at that. Yeah, I'm not sure why he...
It seems like he shouldn't have said that. I didn't see any motivation for endorsing that. Why not just say, just as we only have a weak ability over the past and weak ability over the laws, we also have just a weak ability over the conjunction of those two.
I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure why he said that. But yeah, there has been, you know, debate, a lot of debate about this move, this classical compatibilism. But Lewis, you know, most recently perhaps in this debate, there's a book by Kadri Vivalin in which he kind of develops this, a sympathetic reading of Lewis's response to the consequence argument. But I think there is, yeah, I mean, he thinks again, there's strong and weak readings of the freedoms in question, the freedom to act such that the past is different, the freedom to act such that the laws are different. He thinks the strong readings are implausible, but they're not required by the compatibilism, and the weak readings are plausible, and they're the only thing required by compatibilism. They are required by compatibilism. But really, I think the thing to worry about is whether there is such a big difference in our intuitions between the strong and the weak. In other words, if I say, right, I cannot violate a natural law, I cannot perform an act which is such that it would be inconsistent with the laws of nature, that the act itself, or it would cause something else that's inconsistent with the laws of nature. So his example is, I can't build a machine that would cause particles to go faster than the speed of light. And that's because I'd be doing something which would cause something inconsistent with the laws of nature. And he also doesn't think I, myself, can fly faster than the speed of light, because that would be an act which itself would be inconsistent with the laws of nature. But he thinks, that's crucially different from my doing something such that such that if I were to do it, there would have been a violation of a law just before that. And I just want to say, that's a fine distinction, and maybe there is that distinction, but does it really make a difference intuitively? I mean, it's not clear why that should make a difference. I just think he thinks it does. You first try and get the counterfactuals right, and then you can think about whether there's some conceptual relationship between the true counterfactuals and the ability claim, but there really isn't any reason to worry about conjoining the true counterfactual with the ability claim. Okay, yes, Sophia.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's natural to say that I can't build a machine that makes particles go faster than light because it violates the laws of nature. But maybe if you, like Bibi suggested, don't want to make this big distinction between doing something such that if I did it, there would have been a local miracle or whatever, and violating the laws of nature. Maybe you could say that I can't build a machine that makes things go faster than the speed of light because it is a truth about everything in the entire universe that nothing has the general ability to go faster than the speed of light.
Right.
There are certain truths of that kind, that nothing has the general ability to do this, nothing has the general ability to do that. And then you might still, conflate this distinction and still explain why you can't build that machine, perhaps.
Yeah, so I see. So you might say, because Van Inwagen points out that it would be absurd to tell an engineer, there's a very good engineer, and you tell her, okay, build a machine that will cause particles to go faster than the speed of light. That's just absurd. And what Lewis might say is, yes, that's absurd, but that's because there's a truth to the effect that machines and other things don't have this general ability, or can't have a general capacity to cause.
Nothing whatsoever has the general ability to go faster than the speed of light.
Whatsoever does, but that's a different point from a point about the relevant point about free will. Is that the idea that the free will possibility is just a possibility so to act that some law would have been different just prior?
Yeah,
is that the idea?
Yeah, my idea was that you might say that, sure, people can do things that violate the laws of nature in general because laws of nature are just regularities, but that doesn't mean that we can build a machine that makes things go faster than the speed of light, because it is a truth about the universe that nothing whatsoever has the general ability to go faster than the speed of light. But still, in general, we can do lots of things that changes the laws of nature because they're just regularities. I don't know, it was just an idea that popped up.
I'll have to think more about that because...
Yeah, I just came up with it right now.
Okay.
Maybe that's a problematic way of...
Think more about Matt and then Oksana. Oh no, wait, Oksana and then Matt. Okay.
But why cannot we build such a machine? Well, let it be impossible in our world, but if we are capable to change the world as we are in, why not? We just change the world and build such a machine which makes particles go faster than light in that world we used to be in, why not? But
Well,
that's not...
But I think the problem, so is this what you're asking? I mean, so one way of interpreting what you were just asking about is to say this: if you are a local miracle compatibilist, then you are committed to saying that sometimes we can so act that the laws would have been different just prior. If that move is available to you, why not also say that you could build a machine that would, cause violations of the natural laws after you build it? I mean, why are you entitled to this temporal asymmetry or this important distinction between, what would happen after and what would happen before? It seems like it's placing too much weight on that. Is that?
What I mean is you can have one view, another view, or both. It's possible.
Yes,
but
it's possible.
What I wanted to say like 5 minutes ago,
Okay.
may I hear?
Yes.
Oh.
So you can't change the past, but you can now make the point.
That's right.
Okay. And you can tear that off if you need a clean.
No,
Oh,
I need your picture.
okay.
I was thinking, why should we talk about changing the past? Why should we talk about worlds in terms of going by the river? It's very romantical, but we don't have to. There was a past, and here is now.
What is it?
It's now.
Now,
It's-
okay, yeah.
And we think about going in some sorts of directions. But the thing is, each possibility goes from its own past.
Yes.
They are
That's-
not very different, but still they are different.
Okay, so that's a certain picture that's associated with classical compatibilism of the multiple past kind. So our possibilities correspond to scenarios where the past is different all the way back. Okay.
And then a deliberating person has chosen one of the ways. Which one do you prefer? All right, let it be the left one.
Okay.
And here comes the past.
Yeah.
But you don't have to skip anywhere. Just now, when you are deliberating, you have all of them available right here. It's not like jumping where we were jumping somewhere here. It's not far away. It's just the same place. You can go from here any place, but any direction. But this direction will be коллеги, помогите, определено. Спасибо. Will be defined both ways, to the future and to the past.
So no, I'm not getting this now. So you have to explain it again. Like, first of all, are we assuming causal determinism in this?
Yes.
Okay, so we assume causal determinism, and now we're at now, which is T1, I guess. And that, so in our minds, different paths present themselves as accessible. And there's a straight path, there's a right path, and a left path. And we deliberate and we choose the left path. Mm-hmm. Now, what is the picture? Is the picture that when we choose the left path, there's a past that goes all the way back that's, that's the actual one. That's the actual way things go. But now we ask, could I have chosen the right path? Is that right? Could I have chosen the right? And if you say yes, I think you're committed to saying there's a past associated with the right path that's different all the way back.
Maybe not all the way.
Oh, but yes, okay, or maybe just part of the way back, and that's the Lewis view, that part of the way back there's a different path, but then then there's just one path all the way back into the future from there. That's the Lewis view. Yes, that's a coherent view.
Maybe here is one more time, which is like now, where we could choose something again.
Yeah.
But then, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much, but but when we choose that, what I think it's very interesting. When we choose that, we think that this past has always been our past. We may not even, well, we could imagine there were other possibilities of past, but we never remember them. And we think it's just like that.
You want to say that, like, we choose not only future, but we choose our belief about the past when we choose this way.
I'm thinking about possibilities of this theory of multiply past.
But this introduces a condition of some epistemic condition that we don't know something about our actual past, and when we choose like way left or right, we refill this lack in or this epistemological gap in past. And as far as I understand this, all the other arguments we discussed before, there is a presupposition that like we know all facts about the past, and this epistemic condition is not introduced in
That's
these.
right. We can take one of two possible views. One of them is if our past is defined this time, our memory is defined the same way. We will remember what happened in this line of past, in the actual line. So we will always remember only one past, and it will be very natural for us to think it was just the line without any branches here or here. And one more possibility, and I'm finishing my talking, is not that there are multiple pasts, but that there is a past which is not completely defined. It is there. There could be such a past. They are quite close to each other. There is no such past. Not here. There is no possibility to come here. But there are different possibilities in here. And when we choose something, imagine we do. Now you cannot go here. But you still keep some possibilities. When you choose it right here, you exclude these possible pasts and go forward, and then you choose something else. Kind of
Okay.
like that.
But this is, yeah, go ahead, Dan.
What if, I don't see how you're saying by our choosing a certain alternative, then we close off the past at that point. Why, according to your view, can't we just say that now we still have the ability, after we made that choice, to act such that we didn't make the choice that we did in the past? It seems like your view doesn't have the resources to roll out. So how can you at any point draw the solid line? Because it seems like, well, at any point, if I choose this, it could have been that I chose A in the past. But if I choose this, I chose B in the past. So it seems like you can't draw the solid line at any point.
Well, I cannot tell for sure if your option of changing your mind is somewhere here or somewhere here. Maybe it's just not available. But if it's available, it would be much more complicated. Yes, I think that.
Okay. All right, so I need to move on pretty quickly now, but these discussions show how complex these issues are about changing the past and about compatibilism and how to evaluate it, the consequence argument. I mean, one thing that's come out, which wasn't my intention, but which I welcome, which is fine, is how you get to these disagreements pretty quickly about whether the argument is in fact sound. It's controversial. There are different responses that you can make. Some of the responses, well, the David Lewis style response and others are are appealing to some and not to others, and I think you get to stalemates, or you get to situations where there's no decisive argument one way or the other. At least that's my view, that the argument is pretty compelling, the consequence argument, but that there are reasonable people can disagree with it and reject some of its premises on principled grounds, and there's not going to be a decisive argument. But Matt, did you have something before where I...
Well,
yeah, okay.
I was interested in Viveland's account of Lewis, and I've been reading the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, her article, Incompatibilism, and there she sort of wants to domesticate the view, make it seem less weird, and I've always found his paper very irritating because it seems as if he's not trying to be as clear as he could be, and is deliberately elliptical and a bit perverse in the way he expresses himself. But what she says here is that, so she describes his view and she says, this is just another way of saying something that compatibilists have always said, that someone may have the ability to do X even though she would not exercise her ability unless different circumstances obtained. So the way she seems to interpret it is that, well, he's not saying that there actually are or could be these local miracles. It's just that you've got the general ability to lower your hand. He's got the muscles, the nerves, that kind of control. He's exhibited it in other circumstances. If he's determined not to raise his hand, then he won't. But if he were to, that would mean that the past was different or the laws were different. Not that there actually could be these miracles.
No, I think she has to say there could be these miracles, that an agent has it in his power or her power to do otherwise. I mean, I think that is part of the view. But I think what she's trying to domesticate it in the following sense, that she found, it's been a while since I've read the Viveland book, which I read in manuscript. I haven't read it since it's come out. But she found the term local miracle compatibilism problematic. She thinks it suggests that we can perform miracles in a way that is implausible, but what she wants to say is what that really means, what the view really entails is just sometimes, let's say, again, here's my cup, and I don't raise it. We all think intuitively I could have raised it. I mean, I've been raising it all morning, right? And I could have raised it. What she thinks is what Lewis is saying is, if determinism is true, then the following is also true. That had I raised it, the past just prior to the event would have been a little different from the actual past, and at least one of the laws of nature would have been different right before I did it. Then there's nothing, and further, it's also true that I could have raised my cup. So what's true is the conjunction, I could have raised my cup, and if I had raised my cup, a law of nature would have been different. But there's nothing, it's not as though I'm performing miracles in some, if you go to a faith healer and the faith healer says, I can cure your arthritis, I can perform a miracle, or God, I can assist you in connecting with God, and God will perform a miracle. It's not like that. It's more, I can do something such that if I had done it, a law would have been different. What's the big deal about that, she's saying?
Well, if we have the Humean view, as Sophia was saying, that makes a lot of sense. That's your view of laws. But in the context of the paper, that's not how Lewis is talking about laws at all. So it still sounds like a really weird ability to have.
Well, he doesn't want, at least in that paper, to go all the way to saying I can violate laws of nature. And by violation, he means something specific. He means doing something that itself would be or cause a natural law not to be a natural law. In other words, an actual natural law not to be. And maybe, and you're right, a Humean is going, a thoroughgoing Humean about the natural laws should be willing to say that. But I think he's not, he may be a Humean, but not a thoroughgoing Humean, or he doesn't want to accept that in this paper. And maybe he doesn't want it to accept it because he worries that then there wouldn't be any way of capturing the intuitive idea that I can't fly faster than the speed of light. But maybe there are other ways. There's got to be other ways of capturing that intuition, is what you're saying.
So he says we can't break a law because you just can't, that's a contradiction in terms.
I guess.
In the paper, that's what he says.
Okay, it's a contradiction in terms, or well, at least we just can't do it. That's just
right. Yeah.
it's a
this is not to say that anything would have been a law and broken. That is a contradiction.
Oh, yes, that is.
But to say that something was a law and now it's not because I exercise this ability?
No, it's that there's not, it's a matter of actual things that are true of the actual world and true of another world. In other words, if something is actually a natural law, that's consistent with its, at least on this view, Lewis's view, it's not being a natural law in another possible world. So the natural laws are contingent, and that's what allows him to make this move. There are philosophers like Sidney Shoemaker who've argued that the natural laws are necessary and not contingent, which would not allow for this local miracle compatibilism. I mean, I think Sidney Shoemaker is a compatibilist about free will and freedom to do otherwise, but I think he is a multiple past compatibilist. He thinks you can sometimes do otherwise, and if you had done otherwise, the past would have been different all the way back, but because he thinks the natural laws are necessary. But nothing, I mean, it would be a contradiction in terms to say it's actually a natural law that nothing travels faster than the speed of light. And by the way, I have built a machine in this world that causes protons to go faster than the speed of light. That would be, but what's not supposed to be, and well, let me just say, and he also thinks you can't say, and some engineer could have, or can, either can or could have produced a machine that would cause protons to go faster than the speed of light. But what he thinks is possible is that you can do something such that if you had done it, some natural law wouldn't have been a law. And that's that really fine distinction. It wouldn't have
So
been.
the idea is that it is infinite and now it's not, or that it never had been?
In that other world, it never had been.
We're talking about the real world. I mean, I want to exercise my ability in the real world,
Yes.
not some possible world.
That's
so
right,
if I
but-
actually do it, then
But if
we learn something about what the laws actually are.
We learn, it's tricky. I mean, in the actual world, I don't raise my teacup. I don't raise my cup. And there are certain laws that obtain in the actual world. But now, if determinism is true, he's going to say, if I had raised my cup, there would have been at least one difference in the natural laws. So there would have been a difference all the way in that other world. In that other world, there's just a different set of natural laws. Okay, now the violation in question, or the divergence in question, takes place just before. So it wasn't as though, it may be that there were no instances of law violations in the past in that other world, but it's true of the other world that the laws are different.
We don't have an ability to change laws, but we could jump between worlds.
We can jump between worlds because on Lewis's view, even though the past wouldn't have been different all the way back, it would have been different just prior to. But I want to move on. Okay, I want to move on from Lewis and stuff, and just to at least make this point explicitly and see what you might think about it. And that's this, that it seems to me that this version of the argument, the consequence argument that I just gave, or I gave some time ago now, where I used the Genet principle that an agent can do something only if, or has the power or freedom to do something only if her doing it could be an extension of the actual past holding the laws fixed. So it's a denial of Lewis-style compatibilism. It's a denial of any kind of, it's this idea that our freedom is always the freedom to add to the past holding the laws fixed. If you accept that, you can generate a really simple argument, version of the consequence argument. And my point is, it does not appear that you're using a transfer principle at all. And my further point is, upon reflection, I do not see that you are using a transfer principle at all. I mean, it's not just the initial impression, but I don't see any argument that requires you to use a transfer principle here. And if that's right, then my point would be, although the debates about the transfer principle are interesting, admittedly, and compelling in some sense and interesting, they're not really essential to an evaluation of the consequence argument. Because let's say it turned out that Alexander Proust was right and that you could prove the transfer principle. Or let's say it's right that there are counterexamples to the transfer principle. You know, maybe McKay and Johnston could argue that there are further counterexamples that also apply to any adjustment or revision of the transfer principle, or someone could come up with, you know, counterexamples even to Proust's allegedly proved version of the transfer principle. Still, if you could do the argument without any transfer principle, it wouldn't really matter that there are counterexamples. It's just a feature of one version of the argument rather than another. And there's a huge history of debates, not just in the literature on the relationship between causal determinism and freedom to do others, but strikingly and in a salient way in the literature, the contemporary literature on the relationship between God's foreknowledge and freedom to do others. Because all of these arguments, the arguments about foreknowledge, the arguments about prior truths, and the arguments about scientific explanation, they can all be put in my view, in these different versions. And one way of putting the argument is in terms of the modal principle. So, I mean, so we can do the God's foreknowledge argument that way. How would it work? Okay, this is such a pretty picture. Here. Oksana, this is a gift for you because you do the same. Okay.
That's so nice.
Yes, I'll sign it later. No, okay. So the idea. No, you should sign it. Give it to your children. So the thing is. Oh gosh, why was I even going over here? What was my point? What was I saying?
I'm going to show how it's structurally similar to.
Oh yes, good. The foreknowledge. Thank you. Okay, so this is the way you could do the foreknowledge argument. So if God exists and is in time, and you know some agent like Smith mows lawn on Wednesday, then we know that let's see how we're going to do it. It's power necessary. Oh, it follows, of course, from the fact that God is omniscient and Smith mows lawn on Wednesday, that God knew on Monday that Smith would. So it's necessary for S on Wednesday that God believed on Monday that S would mow on Wednesday. So in other words, if we assume that God exists and is omniscient, essentially omniscient as in time, he's a temporal God, not an atemporal God, and we assume that S mows his lawn on Wednesday, we can deduce that God believed on Monday that Smith would mow on Wednesday. He knew and therefore believed. We're assuming God's knowledge is encoded in believed. So we know that God believed. We can assume, we can derive that God believed on Monday, but then we add, as part of the argument, that it's necessary, it's power necessary, it's out of Smith's control, or S's control on Wednesday, that God had this belief on Monday, because it's part of the past. It's the fixity of the past. But now, we don't need the laws now for this argument. We also know that it's necessary for Smith on Wednesday that if this thing is true, right? If God believed on Monday that Smith would mow on Wednesday, then Smith would mow on, would mow on Wednesday. We know that, right? Because God is essentially omniscient, and nobody can have any control over God's essential omniscience. So now we've got it, right? By the transfer principle, we can conclude it's necessary for S, Smith, on Wednesday, that Smith mows his lawn, let's say, on Wednesday. This is just of the same form we've been talking about. Well, I'll even, Ness, P implies Q, Ness, Q. So you can formulate the argument using the modal principle. And so then there's been this huge brouhaha in the contemporary literature about whether this transfer principle is valid. And people argue, oh no, the transfer principle has counterexamples, therefore we can throw out the argument for incompatibility of God's foreknowledge. But again, my point is, even if this principle is fallacious or not valid, we can generate the argument for incompatibilism in other ways, in ways that don't require this principle, and therefore you still have this worry about God's foreknowledge. Now, of course, let me just say, there are lots of moves you can make in all these debates, and of course one thing that's been said is that God's beliefs are not really genuine features of the past. They're in some sense, they're soft facts or they're temporally relational, and so they shouldn't be considered fixed. And that's all fine. We could debate that. That would be a different seminar, but we could debate that. But all I'm saying is, my point, my bottom line here is, all of these arguments, the argument for the incompatibility of determinism and freedom to do otherwise, the argument for the incompatibility of God's foreknowledge and freedom to do otherwise, the argument for the incompatibility of prior truths about future contingents and freedom to do otherwise, they can be regimented in different ways. And one regimentation is in terms of this kind of modal principle, but you can do it in other ways. You can use the Genet principle, and you can also do the conditional version, which, I present the conditional version in the paper, the paper that was the reading for the second part today. My claim is that these other versions don't, on the surface, use the transfer principle at all. And my further claim is, upon reflection, they don't really depend on the transfer principle. And as you saw, we won't perhaps have time to go through a lot of the free will and the modal principle, but one thing that's going on there is Van Inwagen says that if you consider the conditional version of the argument. Let's do it really quickly, okay? Let's look at that, because I think it's very nice. Like I say, we all think our own children are beautiful. This is my baby, or one of my babies. And so, of course, I think it's a beautiful argument. Here it is. So I think it's kind of interesting to see how you might give a different kind of argument. But just like one's children can be beautiful without being perfect, I agree that this regimentation is not perfect. It's got its little flaws. But, okay, on 214 of my article on the, I say this, it's pretty simple. The conditional version of the argument goes as follows. We suppose that causal determinism is true. That's, remember, the starting point, hypothetically, of all these arguments. We really don't know whether it's true, but let's say, for the sake of argument, it's true. It follows, of course, that statement describing the universe in the past, together with a statement of the laws of nature, entails that you behave as you are behaving now. But now, again, see, what I think is really important in these debates is that we separate questions about ability from counterfactuals. Now, at first. Then we ask about the relationship between the can claims and the counterfactuals. So right now I'm just going to ask, I'm going to say, if determinism is true, and I behave in a certain way, one of the following conditionals must be true. We don't know, I mean, maybe it's controversial which conditional is true. Counterfactuals are notoriously controversial. But one of them's got to be true. So here's the first one. If you were to do otherwise now, then the universe would have been different in the past, all the way back. Second possibility. If you were to do otherwise now, then the natural laws would be different from what they actually are. Another possibility. If you were to do otherwise now, then either the universe would have been different in the past or the natural laws would have been different. Those are the three possibilities that I lay out. I mean, I think I should have been a little bit more careful here, and I think that to capture Lewis's view, because remember, Lewis thinks the past would have been a little different, and the laws would have been different, so a little different. So really, 3 should have been formulated this way. If you were to do otherwise now, then either the universe would have been different in the past, or the natural laws would have been different, or both. I should have said that. Okay, so you probably noticed that, so or both. But it really doesn't change the argument. It just makes it a little more difficult, complicated. But it really doesn't change the argument. But that, you know, that's a possibility too. So, but then the way the argument goes is this: like, first of all, it's plausible, given our intuitions about the fixity of the past, that if conditional 1 were true, that is, if it really were true, that if I were to do otherwise now, the past would have been different all the way back, then it follows, and this is where we get the connection between can claims and counterfactuals. It follows from that counterfactual that I can't do the thing in question. And then I say the same things about the others. Given the fixity of the natural laws, it's plausible that if the second counterfactual were true, that is, if it were true that if I had done otherwise, the laws would have been different, then that shows that I can't do the thing in question. And I wanted to say the same thing about the third possibility, that really, if you think about it, it will turn out that, especially if what we've said so far is true, that if the counterfactual, the following counterfactual is true, that if I had done otherwise, then either the past would have been different, or the laws would have been different, or both, then it follows that I can't do the thing in question. And then, if those are all the possibilities, we get the conclusion that I can't do otherwise, assuming determinism. So this is a different version of the consequence argument. By now, maybe you're getting tired of the consequence argument. But here's a different version of it, and again, it doesn't seem to rely on the transfer principle. And so I want to make the same point about this as I make about the basic version. And let me just say, in a nutshell, what Van Inwagen has said, and we can talk about any aspect of anything that we've discussed, you know, we'll have plenty of time because we'll have a question period for 2 hours after, or an hour and a half after lunch. But what I want to say is the same thing about this argument as I said about the second version that I gave today, the version that uses Genet's principle. I want to say, even upon reflection, it does not require the transfer principle. And what Van Inwagen basically points out is, but you can use, if you use the transfer principle, if you accept the transfer principle, you can derive, you can derive these other principles. You can derive, or you can defend this conditional version of the argument. And I don't deny that. I mean, that's nice. That's showing that the transfer principle is sufficient for the argument, in conjunction with other elements. But my point is, I don't see why it's necessary. I mean, just by pointing out that if you accept the transfer principle, then you can derive some of the other principles in the argument. That doesn't show that you need. That just shows you can derive the argument using that principle. That doesn't show you need it, and my claim is you don't need it. You can see that the argument is forceful without invoking the transfer. Okay, Dan. Let me say, before I get to, let me just say, so this is the simple bottom line for me, is there are certain ingredients that are part of common sense. The fixity of the past, the fixity of the laws. Now, they can be interpreted in different ways and crystallized or regimented in different ways, but they are kind of these common sense ideas. And you can combine them, without using a transfer principle to get a plausible consequence argument. So even if there are reasons to reject the transfer principle, that wouldn't thereby show that the arguments are problematic. Now, even so, I don't think that the arguments are knockdown arguments, and there are definitely problems with even the versions that I've suggested that don't use the transfer principle. So, there are problems, and you can, Lewis and others are going to press on these principles, and say one way of interpreting the principles, is plausible, but you don't get the argument now is not sound. The way of making the argument sound, the principles, or at least valid, the principles aren't going to be are going to be controversial. But all I want to say is you don't really need the transfer principle, and that can be illuminating. That can be deeply illuminating when you read some of the contemporary literature, which seems to presuppose that you need the transfer principle. Okay. Yeah.
I was going to ask. So you were just showing how you could use the transfer principle to sort of argue in a structurally similar way for the incompatibility of infallible foreknowledge and freedom to do otherwise.
Yes.
Now, I was just realizing the way that you do the conditional argument looks actually structurally similar to the way that Nelson Pike argues for the incompatibility of freedom and foreknowledge. And then it's actually interesting because, I believe Lewis's paper comes after Planting as God, Freedom, and Evil, where Planting actually offers a response to Pike's argument that's almost structurally identical to Lewis's point, where he says, I don't need to make change the past or make it the case that one of the beliefs God had, he actually didn't have, or make it the case that it's false. I just need to be able to act such that had I acted one of the beliefs that God actually had, he wouldn't have had, or that, something like that.
Absolutely. I think that's all correct. Let's see. So nice point and it might be, though I didn't ever explicitly make this connection, but I certainly had studied Nelson Pike's article, 1965 article in the Philosophical Review, Divine Omniscience and Voluntary Action, in which Nelson Pike presents the argument for the incompatibility of God's foreknowledge and freedom to do otherwise. Again, he presents it, you can think of Nelson Pike's article as very much similar to Peter Van Inwagen's work, in that Peter Van Inwagen, you could say Peter Van Inwagen did for the consequence argument what Nelson Pike did for the God's foreknowledge argument. They both presented the arguments in a way that avoided the charge that they were obviously committing modal fallacies. That didn't mean that the arguments are obviously sound, but at least they don't obviously commit a certain modal fallacy that people thought. But what Nelson Pike, you're right, Nelson Pike's argument is kind of similar to my conditional argument. And you're also right that Plantinga replied to Pike in a way that's very similar to the way Lewis replies to Van Inwagen. So, let me just say, I think that's all helpful, and I think that's all, further evidence that there are these deep similarities between the arguments having to do with prior truth, God's foreknowledge, and causal determinism. It's not surprising that you could give structurally similar versions of the incompatibilist arguments and then structurally similar versions of the replies in all of these cases. Yeah. Good. Other point. Okay, so any comment or question now? Okay, we're open. Joe.
So I guess one question is, dialectically, why would you mentioned that it seems prudent to have for an incompatibilist to want to be able to say that the consequence argument doesn't require this transfer principle because. Why does Van Inwagen deny it, I guess?
That's interesting. So so here we have this debate, Van Inwagen and me. Van Inwagen initially, in his book, An Essay on Free Will, is I think a really important book. And in that book, he presented three versions of the argument for incompatibility of the consequence argument. And the first version was the modal principle version, but then the second and third version didn't explicitly use principle beta at all. And one was a possible worlds version, which is very similar to the Genet type argument. It just says, if I can do otherwise, there has to be a possible world in which I do otherwise. And further, that possible world has to have the same past as the actual world. That's the fixity of the past. That's what he thinks. It has to branch off. And so he runs the argument like that. And that doesn't seem to use why he actually thinks, though, that they all at a deep level, all the versions at a deep level depend on the transfer principle. And you're right, I made the point, well, it's not really prudent, it's not really argumentatively in the incompatibilist's interest to say that, because what if someone came up with a counterexample to the modal principle? It would be prudent for her to have another version handy. And so I think what is happening is Van Inwagen's doing something that's not, strictly speaking, prudent given his views, but he still believes, I think he believes that the natural way of defending those other principles invokes the modal principle. And it turns out that Genet, right before he introduced his principle, actually says some things that suggests that he's relying on a transfer principle. So it's natural to kind of motivate things that way. But I think he then might slide to the idea that you really need that. I don't think you need it. I think the big question is whether we have access to these principles, but not via the transfer principle. But you're right, it's a little mysterious. I mean, he really is sticking his neck out farther than he needs to there. That's what I would say. But, I think there are, yeah, okay. Other comments about where we've got our questions? Does everybody see how the two, okay, so there's the version of the consequence argument that uses Genet's principle, then there's the version that uses the conditionals, that just says, okay, if determinism is true, and I had done otherwise, if determinism is true, we just have to figure out what would have been the case if I had done otherwise. So which counterfactual is true? But the idea, again, is pretty simple. This is, again, I'm trying to make sure that we can all sing this tune so that you'll say that was a good argument. So the idea is pretty simple. Had I done otherwise, there are certain possibilities. Either the past would have been different all the way back, or the past would have been different a little ways back, and a law would have been different a little ways back, or the past would have been the same and a law would have been different. Those are the possibilities. And given any of those possibilities, it seems that it follows that I couldn't have done otherwise. So here's a way of putting it. If it's a necessary condition, let's say I like the example again of I don't raise my teacup. But let's say it's true that if I had raised it, the past would have been different all the way back. So that shows that in this context, surprisingly, but because determinism is true, it turns out it's a necessary condition of my raising my coffee cup that the past would have been different all the way back. That seems to show that surprisingly, that I couldn't have raised my coffee cup. We all think I could have, but that's because we didn't really keep in mind the fact that it was a necessary condition of my raising it that the past would have been different all the way. And similarly with the laws and so forth. So no matter which possibility obtains with regard to the counterfactuals, it seems to follow that I really couldn't have raised my coffee cup. Yes, that's a skeptical argument. Yes, it goes against common sense, the common sense view that I could have raised my coffee cup, but it uses other parts of common sense. The idea that if it's really a necessary condition of my doing something that the past have been different, or if it's really a necessary condition of my doing something that the laws have been different, then it turns out I can't do it. That's also part of common sense. It's just bringing that out and bringing it together with views about freedom. Okay, Sophia, did you have something?
No, not really.
Okay. Yishai.
One thing about the conditional version and the second version of the consequence argument, where it's like about accessibility to worlds, that I think is interesting is that it seems like it raises a sort of arbitrariness or ad hocness worry for compatibilists. So let's suppose determinism is true, and then we could situate one in a Frankfurt case, or we could situate one in other cases where very intuitively the agent lacks the ability to do otherwise. But you know, we can say, look, there's a possible world where the agent does do otherwise. Right. And so it's just a matter of how much you have to alter or change. Right. And it's not obvious that the compatibilist has a principled way of saying, you know, you can change this much. You can, you know, you can do things such that there's this much distance between where you are and like this other possible world, but you can't reach this other possible world because it's too far. And like, why think that this isn't too far, but this is? It just seems like there's no principled way.
Well, I agree. I think that's good. I think that's really a worry for the compatibilist position that Lewis staked out. I think that, and that's a worry I try to, so in my book, The Metaphysics of Free Will, that was 1994, I discussed Lewis, and I kind of tried to push on this point, is why you can say, yes, no one can violate a natural law, but we sometimes can so act that a law would have been different. But why, I mean, doesn't that seem arbitrary? What's the, you know, what's the motivation for that? I mean, you need some motivation, you need some principled way of making that distinction and making it relevant to freedom claims. So I do think that's a real worry. I mean, I think the best strategy for someone like Lewis is to say, it's all just a matter of counterfactuals and which ones are we think are going to be the true counterfactuals. And once you get an adequate theory that explains which counterfactuals are true, then you just go ahead and add in claims about ability, and that there will be nothing then ad hoc, or there's no. But anyway, I think it's hard to sort through. But I mean, let me just say, I think you're quite right to worry about that, and to wonder whether the compatibilist moves are at some point ad hoc, or at some point just moves to seek to, and they invoke distinctions to seek to bat down this skeptical argument, but in the end, the distinctions, though you can make them, are underdeveloped or something. I don't know. On the other hand, it might depend, a lot depends on what you think the whole dialectic is. If you think there are lots of good reasons to accept compatibilism, and you know, Dan Dennett in his work and others have brought out all sorts of really natural, plausible ways of thinking that compatibilism gives you advantages. If you think of that it's that way, and then you're now playing defense as a compatibilist. You're saying, okay, there are lots of advantages and virtues to compatibilism. Now all I have to do is bat down this argument. I don't have to maybe give a complete explanation of why the argument is, you know, unacceptable. I just have to say, well, you could go ahead and make these distinctions and move such that the argument, and so you're playing defense in a certain way. Maybe that's all you need if you already think there are lots of examples. I mean, I think with American football, what happens sometimes is if a team is leading by 2 or 3 touchdowns going into the fourth quarter, then they start playing defensive. They play defense, which means they're willing to give up 1 score or even 2 scores. They'll still win the game. But they'll slow down, they'll run out the clock. So they're playing defense because they're already way ahead. Okay, and maybe that happens in European football as well, I don't know. But the idea is you don't have to, you can just kind of, you don't have to be aggressive anymore. You can just kind of try and run out the clock. And even if you lose the fourth quarter by a touchdown, you're still going to win the game. Maybe that's the way to think. Maybe a compatibilist will say, I'm winning by 3 touchdowns, and it's the fourth quarter because I have all these advantages to my theory. Now you come, and I'm just going to defend against this pesky worry that you're bringing up at the last minute. That's not really the way to think of it, but I'm going to play defense now, and I still win, even if I can you know, even if I lose this by a little. Anyway, okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to end now. We're going to have lunch. When we come back, you know, be thinking about, you can ask me about any aspect of the consequence arguments or the divine foreknowledge arguments, whatever you want. Okay.